Cold marble pressed against the soles of my shoes as the cathedral doors slowly opened. 200 of the city's wealthiest guests turned to stare at me, their expensive smiles hiding curiosity instead of joy. Every camera flashed. Every whisper echoed beneath the towering stained glass ceiling. This wasn't a wedding. It was the public execution of a woman who had already lost everything. My name is Eleonora Irene, and today I was marrying the most feared mafia boss in Italy. Vittorio Diego Ramos stood waiting at the altar, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his broad shoulders unmoving, his dark eyes completely empty. At 33, he ruled the Ramos syndicate with the same ruthless reputation his late father, Massimo Diego Ramos, once carried. Years earlier, Massimo had been killed during a brutal mafia conflict that tore apart two powerful families and left the city drowning in blood. Vittorio had spent every waking moment searching for revenge. He believed my father was responsible for his father's death. He believed my family stole the man who taught him everything. What he didn't know was that my father had been dead for years, and I had never even learned the truth behind his death. My wicked stepmother made sure of that. The day my father was buried, she wrapped her arms around me, wiped away fake tears, and whispered that the Ramos family had murdered him. I believed every word because I was 19, terrified, and completely alone. My real mother had died years earlier while giving birth to my baby brother. Neither of them survived. After that, my father remarried the woman everyone admired. They called her elegant, gentle, generous. They never saw what happened after the front door closed. They never heard the screams buried inside those walls. When my father died, she took everything. His fortune, his businesses, his home, even my freedom. I became nothing more than the unpaid maid in the house where I had grown up, scrubbing marble floors while the woman who called herself my mother smiled as she reminded me I deserved every scar hidden beneath my clothes. Then, 1 week ago, she handed me to Vittorio Diego Ramos like I was settling an old debt. She called it justice. Vittorio called it revenge. The priest asked whether I accepted the man standing before me as my husband. My voice barely rose above a whisper. I do. Vittorio slid the platinum ring onto my finger without looking into my eyes. His grip was firm, cold, almost punishing. Then he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. His breath brushed my ear as his voice became quieter than the choir surrounding us. This marriage is your family's punishment. I closed my eyes for only a second. If only he knew, the punishment had begun long before he ever learned my name. My earliest memory wasn't pain. It was my mother's voice singing softly while brushing my hair before bedtime. I was only 5 years old, but I still remembered the warmth of her embrace and the gentle kiss she placed on my forehead every single night. Then one cold winter morning, everything changed. My mother went into labor, smiling through the pain as she promised she would come home with my little brother. She never did. Hours later, the front door opened, but only my father walked inside. His face was pale, his eyes swollen from crying. He knelt before me, pulled me into his trembling arms, and whispered the words that shattered my childhood forever. Mama isn't coming home, Ellie. My baby brother never took his first breath. My mother never opened her eyes again. The funeral came and went, but the silence she left behind never disappeared. My father tried his best. He learned to braid my hair, burned more dinners than he successfully cooked, and tucked me into bed every night with tears he thought I couldn't see. For a while, I believed the worst was over. I was wrong. 2 years later, my father introduced me to a beautiful woman named Isabella. She was an elegant widow with graceful manners, expensive perfume, and a smile that convinced everyone she had the kindest heart in Italy. At the wedding, relatives whispered how lucky I was to have another mother. She hugged me in front of every guest and called me her precious daughter. Everyone applauded. Nobody noticed how tightly her fingers dug into my shoulder whenever no one was watching. The day after the wedding, she walked into my bedroom before sunrise and pulled every dress out of my wardrobe. "Pretty girls become spoiled women," she said calmly before throwing my favorite clothes into the fireplace. From that morning forward, I no longer called the mansion my home. It became my prison. I scrubbed marble floors until my knees bled. I polished silver until my fingers cracked. If a speck of dust remained, she smiled before reaching for whatever object was closest. Sometimes it was a leather belt. Sometimes a riding crop. Sometimes a boiling kettle that accidentally spilled whenever she wanted to remind me who controlled my life. Then, when guests arrived, she transformed into the perfect wife. She wrapped blankets around my shoulders, kissed my forehead, and told everyone I was simply clumsy. They believed every lie because monsters don't always look frightening. Sometimes they wore silk dresses and expensive diamonds. My father never saw the truth. Every bruise was hidden beneath long sleeves. Every burn disappeared beneath high collars. Every tear dried before he came home. I learned very quickly that crying only made the punishment last longer. So I stopped crying. I stopped begging. I stopped hoping someone would save me. Silence became my only shield, and surviving became the only thing I was still allowed to dream about.
The morning my father died began like every other. The mansion was unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while I prepared his breakfast exactly the way he liked it: black coffee, buttered toast, and fresh fruit. He had promised me the night before that once he returned from an important meeting, we would finally spend the afternoon together. It was the first promise he had made in months. I waited all morning. By noon, the front gates burst open. Black luxury cars raced into the driveway one after another. Men in dark suits jumped out, their faces pale with panic. I ran outside barefoot, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Then I saw it. My father's body was carried out of the back seat, covered by a white sheet stained with dark patches of blood. My knees gave way beneath me. I screamed until my throat burned, throwing myself toward him, desperate to see his face one last time. Before I could reach him, strong hands pulled me back. Isabella, my stepmother, wrapped her arms around me while pretending to cry. Her tears looked convincing. Her voice trembled perfectly. Anyone watching would have believed she had just lost the love of her life. But when everyone turned away to prepare my father's body, her grip tightened around my wrist until it hurt. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "Listen carefully, Eleonora," she whispered. "The Ramos family murdered your father." My entire world stopped. I stared into her eyes, searching for hope that she was lying. There was none. "Massimo Diego Ramos's people have wanted your father dead for years," she continued softly. "Now they've finally finished what they started." I burst into uncontrollable tears. My father was gone. My mother had been gone for years. I had no brothers, no sisters, no relatives willing to take me in. I was completely alone. The funeral passed like a terrible dream. Wealthy businessmen offered empty condolences before disappearing back to their comfortable lives. Friends promised to stay in touch, but none of them ever returned. As soon as the last guest left, Isabella changed. Her fake tears vanished. Her gentle smile disappeared. She walked straight into my bedroom carrying a small suitcase and dropped it at my feet. "Everything your father owned belongs to me now," she said coldly. "If you want a roof over your head, you'll earn it." From that day forward, I stopped being the daughter of the house. I became its servant. Before sunrise every morning, I scrubbed marble floors, cleaned endless rooms, washed dishes until my hands cracked, and polished furniture that would never belong to me. The servants pitied me, but nobody dared challenge Isabella. They all feared the beautiful widow with the angelic smile. Every night, after ordering me to clean one final room, she would stand alone in my father's office, pour herself a glass of expensive wine, and smile into the darkness. Hidden inside the drawer of her mahogany desk rested documents no one else had ever seen, documents that proved my father's death was no accident, and that the Ramos family had never been responsible at all. But I knew nothing of her secret. I only knew that one day I would belong to the man I believed had destroyed my family. The last guest finally disappeared into the cold night, and the music that had filled the Ramos estate faded into silence. Crystal chandeliers still glowed above the empty ballroom, but the celebration had ended hours ago. It had never truly been a celebration anyway. It had been a victory parade for the man who believed he had finally avenged his father. A maid quietly led me upstairs before disappearing without a word. The master suite overlooked the dark sea, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the crashing waves below. Everything inside the room was black, silver, and cold, just like the man who owned it. I stood beside the window, my wedding veil already removed, staring into the darkness while listening to my own heartbeat. A few moments later, the bedroom door opened. Vittorio Diego Ramos stepped inside, loosening his black tie as he quietly closed the door behind him. His expression remained unreadable. He walked past me, poured himself a glass of whiskey, then turned to face me. "The performance is over," he said calmly. "Take off the dress." There was no anger in his voice. No tenderness either. It was simply an order. I lowered my eyes and slowly reached for the tiny pearl buttons around my high lace collar. One by one, they slipped free beneath my trembling fingers. The silence inside the room became unbearable. I loosened the sleeves before reaching behind my back, searching for the hidden zipper. My fingers shook. The zipper refused to move. I tried again. Nothing. Vittorio sighed impatiently before setting his glass onto the table. "Turn around." I obeyed without speaking. He stepped behind me. I felt the warmth of his hands for the first time as his fingers found the zipper hidden beneath the delicate lace. With one slow movement, he pulled it downward. The soft sound echoed through the room. My wedding gown loosened around my shoulders. I closed my eyes. Gravity did the rest. The heavy white fabric slipped silently to the floor around my feet. Cold air brushed against my bare back. Then, nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No words. The silence stretched so long it became frightening. Finally, I heard Vittorio inhale sharply, as though the air had been ripped from his lungs. I didn't need to turn around to know what he was seeing. Thick scars crossed my back from shoulder to waist like twisted rivers carved into my skin. Old whip marks overlapped faded burn scars. Some wounds had healed into jagged white lines, while others remained dark reminders of years I wished I could erase. Every mark carried the memory of a punishment I never deserved. Every scar had a story I had buried long ago. Vittorio remained completely motionless. The ruthless Mafia boss who had terrified judges, politicians, and rival syndicates stood frozen behind me, unable to utter a single word. I slowly gathered the front of my dress against my chest before turning to face him. His dark eyes weren't filled with hatred anymore. They were filled with disbelief. His jaw tightened as he stared at the scars that reached around my shoulders and disappeared beneath the torn fabric. The glass of whiskey slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. His voice barely escaped his lips. "Who?" He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the scars. "Who did this to you?" Vittorio stood frozen in the middle of the room, his chest rising and falling unevenly as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The shattered whiskey glass lay scattered across the marble floor, amber liquid slowly spreading beneath his polished shoes. His dark eyes remained locked on the scars covering my body, searching them as if they might suddenly disappear. They didn't. They had been with me for more than 15 years. They weren't going anywhere. I quietly bent down, lifted the silk robe resting at the foot of the bed, and wrapped it around myself. The soft fabric brushed against my scarred skin, but even that gentle touch made old wounds ache. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Vittorio broke the silence. "Your father didn't do this." It wasn't a question. I slowly shook my head. "No." His brows drew together. "Then who?" I looked past him toward the rain beating against the bedroom windows. Saying her name still made my stomach tighten. "My stepmother." His eyes narrowed. "The elegant widow?" I gave a bitter smile that never reached my eyes. Elegant when people were watching. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. A monster when they weren't. Vittorio didn't interrupt. For the first time since I had met him, he simply listened. "After my mother died giving birth to my little brother, my father married Isabella. Everyone loved her. She hosted charity dinners, donated money to orphanages, smiled for newspapers, and kissed my forehead whenever guests visited." I looked down at my trembling hands. The moment the front door closed, she became someone else. My voice grew quieter. She beat me because dinner was cold, burned me because I answered too slowly, locked me in the basement for days whenever she was angry. Sometimes she smiled while she did it. Vittorio's jaw tightened so hard the muscles beneath his skin trembled. "Where was your father?" I closed my eyes. "Working, traveling, building his business." She made sure he never saw what happened. Every bruise was hidden beneath long sleeves. Every burn beneath high collars. She always told him I was clumsy. A painful silence settled between us. "The day my father died," I whispered. She held me while I cried and told me your family murdered him. Vittorio's eyes widened. "She blamed the Ramos family?" I nodded slowly. I believed her. "I hated your family for years because I thought you had taken everything from me." He turned away, dragging both hands across his face. Everything he had believed, every reason for forcing this marriage, began collapsing before his eyes. He had married me to punish the daughter of the man he blamed for his father's death. Instead, he had chained himself to a woman who had been living in hell long before he entered her life. He looked back at me, but there was no cruelty left in his expression. Only guilt, and something far heavier. "Eleonora," he said quietly. I was wrong. I stared at him, unsure what those words were supposed to change. The past couldn't be undone. The scars couldn't disappear. Neither could the years stolen from my life. Vittorio slowly closed the distance between us. He stopped just inches away, careful not to touch me until I lifted my eyes to meet his. Then, with surprising gentleness, he rested his warm hand against my cheek. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with a promise that sent tears burning behind my eyes. Nobody touches you again. For the first time in years, I wanted to believe someone. 3 days passed after our wedding, but the image of the scars on my back refused to leave Vittorio's mind. Every meeting he attended, every deal he negotiated, every order he gave, his thoughts always drifted back to the same question. Why would a woman who appeared so graceful in public torture her own stepdaughter? It didn't make sense. Monsters usually left traces behind. Vittorio intended to find them. Without telling me, he ordered his most trusted men to reopen every file connected to my family. Old police reports, hospital records, property transfers, financial statements. Even forgotten newspaper archives were pulled from dusty storage rooms. For nearly a week, his private study remained lit long after midnight. Thick folders piled across his mahogany desk while cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Isabella looked exactly as the world remembered her. A respected widow, generous donor, patron of children's charities, elegant hostess. Every newspaper praised her kindness. Every photograph showed the same flawless smile. But Vittorio had spent his entire life hunting liars. He knew perfection was usually the best disguise. Then Sal walked into the study carrying a faded leather folder. "Boss, I think you need to see this." Vittorio opened the file. Inside were bank transfers made just weeks before my father's death. Millions of dollars had quietly disappeared from family accounts into shell companies hidden overseas. None of the signatures belonged to my father. Every authorization had been forged. Vittorio's expression hardened. Who benefited? Sal slid another document across the desk. Isabella Irene. Vittorio's eyes narrowed. She inherited everything within 48 hours of your father's funeral. Another page revealed secret life insurance policies that had been quietly increased only months before my father's mysterious death. Every payout had gone directly to Isabella. Another folder exposed hidden properties she owned under false names. Luxury villas, offshore accounts, safe deposit boxes filled with cash and jewelry that had never appeared in any inheritance records. She hadn't simply inherited wealth. She had been preparing for it. Then came the discovery that changed everything. An intelligence report from years earlier listed several businessmen secretly financing the bloody conflict between the Ramos family and their rivals. One name appeared again and again beside encrypted payments and private meetings. Isabella. She wasn't merely connected to powerful people. She had secretly financed men responsible for supplying weapons during the war that claimed Massimo Diego Ramos's life. Vittorio stared at the documents in stunned silence. If the records were genuine, then Isabella had been feeding both sides of the conflict while making fortunes from every shipment of bloodshed. She hadn't just manipulated my father. She had manipulated an entire Mafia war. Sal slowly placed one final envelope on the desk. We found this hidden behind a false wall inside Isabella's private office. Vittorio opened it carefully. Inside rested old letters written in Massimo's handwriting, letters proving my father had been secretly working with Massimo to expose the corrupt businessmen profiting from the war. Neither man had betrayed the other. They had been trying to stop the violence together. Vittorio slowly lowered the papers, his heartbeat thundering inside his chest. Every reason he had spent years hating my family was collapsing before his eyes. Isabella hadn't simply abused an innocent little girl. She had stolen fortunes, forged documents, manipulated two families, framed the Ramos name, and buried the truth beneath years of carefully crafted lies. Vittorio leaned back in his chair, his voice barely above a whisper. The devil never wore horns. His eyes hardened with quiet fury as he looked toward the rain-soaked window. She wore silk. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Thick clouds hung over the Ramos estate, turning the ocean beyond the towering windows into a restless sheet of gray. I sat alone in the library, pretending to read a novel I hadn't turned a single page of in over an hour. My thoughts refused to settle. Ever since our wedding night, Vittorio had become strangely distant. He wasn't cold anymore. If anything, he had become too quiet. He disappeared for hours, returned long after midnight, and spent most of his time locked inside his private study. Every time I asked if something was wrong, he simply answered, "Soon." That single word frightened me more than silence ever could. Then, late one evening, the library doors opened. Vittorio walked in carrying a thick leather folder beneath one arm. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't victorious. It looked broken. "Eleonora," he said softly. "There's something you need to see." I followed him into his study without asking questions. The fire crackled quietly inside the stone fireplace while dozens of documents covered the massive mahogany desk. Photographs, bank records, old letters, signed statements, each one carefully arranged as though they were pieces of a puzzle waiting to be completed. Vittorio pulled out a chair for me before taking the seat across from mine. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he slid the first photograph toward me. It showed my father standing beside another man, both smiling as they shook hands outside a warehouse. My breath caught in my throat. The second man was younger, but I recognized him immediately from the portraits hanging throughout the Ramos mansion. Massimo Diego Ramos. "No," I whispered. "That can't be." Vittorio nodded slowly. "My father and yours weren't enemies." He opened another file. Inside were handwritten letters exchanged between the two men over several years. They spoke of trust, partnership, and their shared determination to expose a network of corrupt businessmen secretly fueling the Mafia war for profit. My hands began trembling. "They were working together," I whispered. "Yes." Vittorio's voice was heavy with regret. "Someone made sure neither family ever discovered the truth." He placed another document before me. It was a list of financial transfers signed by Isabella. Millions of dollars had been secretly funneled to the very men supplying weapons to both sides of the conflict. The longer I stared, the harder it became to breathe. Vittorio continued quietly. "The businessmen betrayed both our fathers. They arranged the ambush that killed Massimo." My eyes filled with tears. "And my father?" Vittorio swallowed hard before answering. "After your father began suspecting Isabella's involvement, she couldn't risk him exposing her." He reached for the final folder. Inside rested a signed confession from one of the assassins, obtained only days earlier before entering witness protection. The words blurred through my tears. Isabella had hired them. She ordered my father's murder. then blamed the Ramos family before anyone could question her story. The room began spinning. Every memory, every tear, every night I had hated the Ramos name had been built on a lie. My chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. A sob escaped before I could stop it. She killed him. I whispered. She killed my father. My body gave out beneath me. The chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor as I collapsed to my knees, shaking uncontrollably. Years of grief crashed over me all at once. I hadn't only lost my parents, I had spent years hating the wrong family while the woman responsible tucked me into bed each night and called herself my mother. Vittorio was beside me before I realized he had moved. He wrapped both arms around me as I buried my face against his chest, crying harder than I ever had in my life. He didn't try to stop my tears. He simply held me while my world shattered. Then, resting his chin gently against my hair, he whispered with quiet conviction, "I couldn't save our fathers, but I swear to you, Eleonora, Isabella will answer for every life she destroyed." The mansion that had stolen my childhood looked exactly the same. The towering iron gates, the marble fountain, the perfectly trimmed roses lining the driveway. Anyone passing outside would think kindness lived behind those walls. They would never hear the screams those walls had swallowed. Vittorio's black SUV rolled to a quiet stop. Rain dripped steadily across the windshield. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. My hands rested calmly on my lap. Months ago they would have been shaking. Not today. Vittorio reached across the console and placed a small recording device inside my palm. "She'll confess," he said quietly. "Women like Isabella always mistake confidence for invincibility." I looked at the recorder before slipping it into my coat pocket. "And if she doesn't?" Vittorio's dark eyes met mine. "She will." He wasn't guessing. He knew monsters. "I'll be right outside. The moment you need me, I come in." I nodded once before stepping into the rain. Every step toward the front door felt like walking through ghosts. My scars seemed to ache beneath my clothes as old memories clawed at the back of my mind. I refused to let them win. The maid answered the door. Her face turned pale the instant she recognized me. Miss Eleonora. Tell Isabella I'm here." The maid hurried away. Seconds later, elegant heels echoed across the marble hallway. Isabella appeared at the top of the staircase, wearing an expensive black silk gown, diamonds glittering around her neck. She hadn't changed. Beautiful, cold, deadly. She smiled as though greeting an old friend. "Well, look who's come home." I stared at her without blinking. This was never my home. Her smile barely moved. Still dramatic. She slowly descended the staircase. "I heard you married the Ramos boy. Quite the promotion for a maid." I came for the truth. Isabella laughed softly. Truth. She poured herself a glass of wine before sitting comfortably in Father's favorite chair. "Truth is expensive, Eleonora." I stepped closer. "Did you kill my father?" She didn't even hesitate. She lifted her glass and took a slow sip. "Of course I did." My heartbeat stopped. Isabella smiled wider, enjoying every second of my silence. "Your father became suspicious. He started asking questions about the money, about Massimo Ramos, about the businessmen I was working with." She shrugged carelessly. "Curious husbands don't live very long." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "And my mother?" Isabella laughed again. "Your poor little saint of a mother? She died before I ever arrived." "Lucky for me." She leaned forward, her eyes glowing with cruelty. "You know, raising you became rather entertaining." My stomach twisted. Every scar on your body," she whispered proudly, "was a lesson. Every whip, every burn, every night you cried. I enjoyed every second." My breathing became uneven. Isabella stood, slowly circling me like a predator admiring trapped prey. "You looked so much like your mother." She reached out, brushing one finger across my cheek. "Hurting you made me feel powerful." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "You never loved me." Isabella laughed loudly. "Love you?" She looked genuinely amused. "You were nothing more than free labor until I inherited everything. I wanted your father's fortune, his businesses, his properties, and after he died, I wanted yours too." She leaned close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. "You were always in the way." I looked directly into her eyes. "So you destroyed 2 families, for money." "Not just money." Isabella smiled proudly. "Power, wealth, control. Men are easy to manipulate when they think they're making the decisions." She straightened her dress. "Massimo Ramos died because useful fools followed my instructions. Your father died because he became inconvenient. And you." She smirked cruelly. "You survived because watching you suffer was far more satisfying." A long silence filled the room. Then, slowly, I reached into my coat pocket. Isabella frowned as I removed the small recording device. The tiny red light blinked steadily. Her smile disappeared. The front door burst open. Heavy footsteps thundered across the marble floor. Vittorio Diego Ramos entered with Sal and several armed capos behind him. His face was carved from stone. He looked at Isabella with absolute contempt before calmly holding up his phone. "Every word," he said quietly. The confession spread through the room like poison. Isabella stood frozen, her confident smile gone, the color draining from her face as Vittorio held up the recorder. The tiny red light blinked steadily, capturing every word she had proudly spoken. For the first time since I had known her, fear replaced arrogance in her eyes. She looked from me to Vittorio, then to the armed capos surrounding the entrance. Every escape had vanished. "You tricked me," she hissed, taking a slow step backward. Vittorio didn't move. His expression remained cold, unreadable. "No," he replied calmly. "You exposed yourself." Isabella laughed suddenly, but the sound was desperate. "You think this changes anything? Half this city owes me favors." Vittorio reached into his coat and removed a thick folder. He tossed it onto the marble floor at her feet. Papers scattered across the room. Bank statements, property deeds, court warrants, financial records. Every secret she had buried was now laid bare. "Those favors disappeared this morning," Vittorio said. "Every offshore account has been frozen. Every shell company has been seized. Every hidden warehouse now belongs to the Ramos syndicate under federal supervision." Isabella's eyes widened as she hurriedly picked up the documents. Her hands began shaking. "No, this isn't possible." Vittorio continued without emotion. "The businessmen who protected you accepted immunity in exchange for testimony. They surrendered every ledger with your signature, every transfer, every bribe, every murder you paid for." Isabella's breathing became ragged. "They betrayed me?" "The greedy always betray each other," Vittorio answered. "That's why they never win." She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, dialing one number after another. No one answered. She called another. Straight to voicemail. Another. The call was rejected. Her powerful allies, the politicians, the corrupt businessmen, the mafia captains she had manipulated for years, every single one had abandoned her. She slowly lowered the phone. The silence inside the mansion became unbearable. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I built everything." I finally stepped forward. My voice was calm, steady, stronger than it had ever been. "No, Isabella." I looked directly into her terrified eyes. "You stole everything." Tears streamed down her face, but they earned no sympathy. "Please, Eleonora," she begged. "I raised you." I stared at the woman who had stolen my childhood, murdered my father, tortured me for years, and destroyed 2 families for wealth. My heart felt strangely peaceful. "No," I answered quietly. "You imprisoned me." Suddenly, the front doors burst open. Heavy boots echoed across the marble floor. A team of detectives entered alongside federal agents carrying arrest warrants. The lead investigator unfolded a document before looking directly at Isabella. "Isabella Moretti," he announced firmly. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and multiple counts of homicide." She stumbled backward until her legs struck the staircase. 2 officers stepped forward and secured handcuffs around her wrists. "You can't arrest me," she screamed. "Do you know who I am?" The detective looked at her without expression. "A criminal." They escorted her toward the front door. She fought, she screamed. She cursed my name and Vittorio's, but nobody came to save her. The same servants who once feared her watched silently as she was dragged outside. The flashing blue lights illuminated the mansion as reporters crowded beyond the gates. Cameras captured the woman who had once ruled through fear being placed inside a police vehicle like any other criminal. The doors slammed shut. The convoy disappeared into the night. I stood in the silent foyer, staring through the open doorway long after the sirens faded into the distance. Vittorio walked beside me, slipping his hand gently into mine. "It's over," he whispered. I looked toward the empty road where Isabella had disappeared forever. For the first time in my life, justice had finally arrived. 6 months changed everything. Winter surrendered to spring, and the Ramos estate no longer felt like a fortress built for war. Sunlight poured through the towering windows each morning, warming halls that had once echoed with silence. Fresh flowers rested on marble tables. Laughter drifted through rooms that had known nothing but strategy and bloodshed. I stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, the cool breeze lifting my dark hair as workers planted new roses beneath the stone terrace. Months ago, I had arrived here wearing a wedding dress that hid my scars and a heart convinced it deserved nothing except suffering. Now I wore confidence instead of fear. The scars were still there beneath my clothes, but they no longer defined the woman looking back at me in the mirror. They had become proof that I survived everything meant to destroy me. Behind me, the balcony doors opened quietly. Vittorio stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. His dark suit was replaced by rolled sleeves and black trousers, the intimidating Mafia boss now looking more like the man I had come to know beyond the empire. Without saying a word, he handed me one of the cups before resting beside me against the stone railing. Our shoulders touched naturally, peacefully. "The northern warehouses are profitable again," he said with a small smile. "Your management team made another impossible deal." I laughed softly. "Your accountants finally stopped arguing with me. They learned quickly." He looked toward the gardens where dozens of employees worked together. Everyone did. Together we had rebuilt more than businesses. Families who had once buried sons because of the war now worked side by side. Honest companies replaced criminal partnerships. Scholarships were created in the names of Massimo Diego Ramos and my father, honoring two innocent men whose friendship had been stolen by lies. Safe homes opened for abused women and children, funded with every dollar recovered from Isabella's fortune. No child would ever endure what I survived if I could prevent it. Vittorio quietly reached for my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. His wedding ring caught the morning sunlight. "Regret anything?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. The man who had once whispered that our marriage was punishment now looked at me with nothing except love and respect. "Only one thing," I answered softly. His eyebrows lifted. "I wish we had known the truth sooner." He nodded slowly. "So do I." Silence settled comfortably between us as birds circled above the cliffs overlooking the sea. Finally, I leaned my head against his shoulder. "I was terrified of you," I admitted with a smile. Vittorio kissed the top of my head. "I know. Funny," I whispered. The man I feared most became the safest place I've ever known. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, holding me close. "You saved me too, Eleonora. Revenge built my empire, but you gave me a reason to protect something instead of destroying it." Tears filled my eyes, not from pain but from gratitude. Family was never the blood that abandoned me. Family was the hand that stayed when the truth became unbearable. Family was the man who looked beyond my scars and saw the woman beneath them. I had entered this house believing I was nothing more than a broken maid offered as payment for another person's sins. I stood here now as Eleonora Irene Ramos, wife, queen, survivor, and equal beside the man who had once been my enemy. They thought revenge would end our story. Instead, it became the beginning of a love strong enough to bury the past, powerful enough to rebuild two broken legacies, and courageous enough to prove that scars never define the people who carry them. They only remind the world that, even after unimaginable darkness, some souls still choose love, still choose truth, and above all, still choose family. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If Eleonora and Vittorio's journey touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next unforgettable Mafia romance. We'd also love to hear from you, so drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and which moment in the story was your favorite. No matter where you are in the world, you're part of this amazing family, and we're truly grateful to have you here. Until our next story, take care, stay blessed, and we'll see you in the next thrilling Mafia tale.